I have always hated the sound of my own footsteps, not because they were loud, but because every dull thud against the ground echoed in my soul with pain and fear. For 30 years now, I have heard this sound every morning, every day, every night, and there has not been a single minute of silence. 30 years ago, I put on iron boots, and from that day on, I have never taken them off. You probably think I've gone insane, that this is some kind of strange game or illness. But no, these boots are not just metal and leather. They are my fate, my curse, and my path to redemption for once being a coward and a traitor. I am 53 years old now, but I look much older because the iron boots have drained all the youth from me, all the joy, everything that makes a person feel alive. Every morning when I wake up, the first thing I feel is their weight on my feet, the cold metal that never warms from the heat of my body, the heaviness that drags me down to the ground like an anchor tied to the soul of a drowning man. 30 years ago, I was a completely different person, a young, successful manager in a large construction company. I had a beautiful wife who laughed like a ringing bell and looked at me as if I were her whole world. We lived in a nice 3-room apartment in the city center, drove an expensive German car, and planned to buy a house in the countryside with a big garden where our future children could play and grow up. I thought life was perfect, that I was smarter and better than others, that I deserved all the blessings I had. In the mornings, I woke up in silk sheets, had breakfast with fresh croissants and coffee made from the best beans in the world, put on expensive Italian suits, and drove to the office in my shining car, feeling like the king of this world. I was ambitious, greedy for success, and absolutely sure that the world was created for people like me, people who are not afraid to take what they want and do whatever it takes to achieve their goals. But fate, as always ironic and merciless, had prepared a lesson for me that would forever change my understanding of what the true price of success is and how terrifying it can be when you pay for it with the lives of others. In our company, there worked a simple chief accountant, an elderly man of about 60, with kind, tired eyes behind thick glasses and an honest soul that shone in every word and action. He had faithfully served the company for many years, came to work earlier than anyone else, and left later than everyone else. He never lied, never flattered anyone, always told the truth even when it was extremely inconvenient and could cause serious problems. He lived modestly in an old 1-room apartment on the outskirts of the city, commuted to work by public transport, wore the same worn-out suit that his late wife had carefully mended, and his only joy in life was his sick daughter, who was paralyzed and confined to a wheelchair after a car accident. He raised her alone after his wife's death, spent all his money on medicines and rehabilitation, and his entire life was devoted to working to provide for them and caring for the only close person he had left in this world. This man was the embodiment of honesty and decency in a world where these qualities were becoming increasingly rare. And it was precisely his honesty that became the reason for the tragedy that destroyed several lives, including my own. One rainy autumn evening, when the endless rain was pouring outside the office windows and the city was drowning in gray melancholy, this accountant stayed late at work to finish the quarterly report and accidentally discovered something that changed everything. He found documents that showed that our general director, a man with the face of a politician and the manners of a socialite, had already, for several years, he had been systematically embezzling money from the company's budget, falsifying financial reports, inflating expenses for non-existent projects, and transferring millions of rubles to fake accounts registered under fake names. It was a grand scheme that had been going on for years, and if it were exposed, it would not only bankrupt the company, but also leave hundreds of honest people who knew nothing about their boss's crimes, without jobs or means of survival. The old accountant spent a sleepless night studying the documents, checking the numbers, and by morning, he understood the scale of the catastrophe that was looming over the company. He realized that if this embezzlement wasn't stopped, very soon everything would collapse. Creditors would file lawsuits, employees would be left without salaries and pensions, and the guilty party would disappear with the stolen millions, leaving behind only ruin and misery. The next day, early in the morning, he came to my office. I was the Deputy General Director for Financial Affairs, and he quite reasonably believed that I was the one who needed to know what was happening and take action. The old man looked exhausted and agitated, his hands trembling as he laid the documents out before me and explained the scheme of theft. His voice broke with emotion as he spoke about the danger that threatened the company and everyone who worked there. "Look," he said, pointing to the figures in the reports. Here are fictitious expenses for office repairs that no one ever did. And here are payments for building materials that no one ever ordered. And here, money transferred to the account of a company that doesn't even exist. This is pure theft, and it's been going on for 3 years in a row. I looked at these documents and felt my insides turn cold with horror. Not horror at the scale of the theft, but horror at what might happen to me if this information came to the attention of law enforcement. I understood that if we handed these documents over to the prosecutor's office, the general director would indeed go to prison, the company would be shut down, and I would lose my high-paying position, my spacious office overlooking the city center, the company car, and the bonuses and perks that allowed me to live like a wealthy man. But worst of all, I knew our general director very well. I knew that he had powerful connections in law enforcement, influential friends among judges and prosecutors, and that he was an absolutely ruthless and unscrupulous man who would stop at nothing to save himself. I understood that he could easily twist the case so that the main culprit would appear to be this honest old accountant who had simply been doing his job too diligently. Or perhaps the accusations would even fall on me, as the deputy who should have known about financial violations, but either didn't or pretended not to. Fear for my own skin, greed, the desire to keep my comfortable life. All of this turned out to be stronger than my sense of justice and human compassion. And so, instead of supporting the honest man who was risking everything for the sake of justice, I said to him the words that would burn my conscience like molten iron for the next 30 years. Listen, I said, trying to speak calmly and reasonably, maybe we shouldn't rush to conclusions. Let's first carefully study these documents, consult with the lawyers, and only then make a decision. Perhaps there are explanations for these discrepancies. Maybe these are just accounting errors or misunderstandings that can be corrected without attracting the attention of the regulatory authorities. The old accountant looked at me with his kind, tired eyes, and I saw surprise and disappointment in them. But, he said, don't you understand that these are not mistakes? This is deliberate theft. Everything here is calculated down to the last penny. The scheme is worked out to the smallest detail. If we keep silent, he will steal even more, and then disappear, leaving all of us to answer for his crimes. We must act immediately before it's too late. But I had already made my vile decision and began to persuade the honest man that it was better not to interfere in matters that could end badly for everyone involved. I told him that the evidence might turn out to be insufficient, that accusations against the general director could backfire on us, that it would be better to wait and see how events unfolded. I exploited his greatest weakness, his love and care for his sick daughter. I told him that if he lost his job because of this situation, who would pay for her treatment and care? Who would look after her if he himself ended up in prison on false charges of complicity in the embezzlement? For a week, I worked on this unfortunate old man, played on his fears and doubts, convinced him that silence was the best way out of the situation. I saw how he suffered, how he struggled with himself, how his honest nature resisted my arguments. But the fear for his daughter turned out to be stronger than his sense of duty. In the end, he believed me. He agreed to delay filing a report with law enforcement and even destroyed the copies of the documents he had made for himself, just in case. I convinced him that this was necessary for our mutual safety, that if these papers fell into the wrong hands, we would all suffer, while the general director, as usual, would come out clean. Meanwhile, I went to our boss. I went to the thief and told him everything the old accountant had discovered. The general director listened to me calmly, even with a slight smirk. Then he leaned back in his expensive leather chair and said the words that finally turned me into an accomplice to the crime. You're a smart man, he said. You understand how this life works. Everyone must think about themselves and their own interests. That old fool could have created huge problems for all of us, but you did the right thing by coming to me instead of running to the prosecutor's office. Let's make a deal. You keep an eye on our principal accountant and make sure he keeps his mouth shut, and I'll make you my partner. I'll give you a share in our common business, and together we'll live rich and carefree. What do you say? I said yes because I was a weak, greedy, and cowardly man who feared losing his well-being more than he feared betraying the person who had trusted me. From that day on, I became an accomplice in multi-million-dollar embezzlement schemes, received my share of the criminal profits, and kept silent like a fish while looking into the honest old man's eyes. The man who had believed my words and refused to fight for justice to protect his sick daughter's safety. But, as often happens, crimes tend to eventually come to light. 8 months later, the scheme was exposed anyway, but in a completely different scenario than it would have been had we reported it to law enforcement in time. One of the contractor firms did not receive payment for the work they had actually completed and filed a lawsuit to recover the debt. During the court proceedings, it turned out that the money for this work had been transferred, but to a completely different account that had no relation to the plaintiff. An investigation began, and like a snowball, it gathered more and more evidence of theft, forged documents, and fraud. But, as I had suspected, our general director had no intention of taking responsibility for his crimes. He truly had connections in law enforcement, and he used them to steer the investigation in the wrong direction.